What is happening right now between the United States and Venezuela is probably the most brutal, most self-destructive, and most revealing contradiction of imperial decline that I have seen in more than 4 decades of analyzing global political economy. We are talking about a president, Donald Trump, who in December 2025 ordered a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela, who threatened with the largest navy ever assembled in the history of South America, in his own words on Truth Social, who seized oil ships off the Venezuelan coast, who accused the government of Nicolás Maduro of stealing oil rights from the United States. And yet, at the very same time, that same president depends desperately, structurally, and technically on Venezuelan oil so that his own economy does not collapse. Let me explain clearly what is really happening, why this is a trap the United States cannot escape from, and above all, what this means for the future of the American empire. I have spent more than 40 years studying political economy, how power systems truly work, how empires build dominance, and how they lose it. I am an emeritus professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I have taught at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. I have analyzed oil crises, financial collapses, and wars over resources. I have studied the contradictions of late capitalism and the tensions between imperial rhetoric and material reality. And I can say with complete certainty that what we are witnessing now is an empire that no longer understands its own dependence, that can no longer reconcile its story of power with its structural weakness, and that is making decisions that weaken it exactly when it believes it is showing strength. The core argument is devastating but simple. The United States needs Venezuelan oil not as a luxury, not as a convenient option, but as a technical and industrial necessity so that its refineries can operate, so that it can produce the diesel that moves its economy, and so that it can keep fuel prices under control. And yet Trump is blocking the very oil that the country needs. He is sanctioning the ships that carry it and threatening militarily the country that produces it. It is like a thirsty man in the desert, destroying the only well of water available because he does not like who controls that well. This is self-destruction disguised as toughness. But here is what almost no one understands, and it is essential to grasp the full size of this contradiction. The United States produces more oil than any country in history. That is true. The fracking revolution turned the United States into the world's largest producer of crude oil. But here is the technical problem that Trump either does not understand or deliberately ignores. The oil produced through fracking is too good, too light. It is light, sweet crude. It is perfect for making gasoline, but it is very bad for making diesel, asphalt, fuel for heavy machinery, and all the products that an industrial economy truly needs. Phil Flynn, senior market analyst at Price Futures Group, explained this with brutal clarity. Most U.S. refineries were built specifically to process heavy Venezuelan oil. They were designed in the 1960s and 1970s when Venezuela was a reliable and nearby supplier. These refineries on the Gulf Coast, in Texas and Louisiana, are the most sophisticated in the world, but they are optimized for heavy and sour crude. If you try to feed them only with light fracking oil, they operate inefficiently. You produce too much gasoline that the market cannot absorb and far too little diesel, which is desperately needed. The technical solution the United States has been using is blending. You take ultra-light fracking crude and mix it with ultra-heavy crude from Venezuela or Canada, and you get a synthetic crude that looks like conventional oil that refineries can process efficiently. Antonio Turiel, a Spanish scientist and expert on peak oil, explained this in a recent interview. The mixture is essential. Fracking oil on its own does not work for the refining system as it is designed. Its molecular chains are too short, and it does not produce enough middle distillates, especially diesel. By mixing it with extra heavy crudes that have very long chains, you create an artificial crude that actually works. The United States has invested billions of dollars adapting its refineries to this model, building coking units, hydrotreating units, and an entire sophisticated infrastructure to process blends of ultralight and very heavy oil. Once that investment is made, you absolutely need that kind of mixture. You cannot change it overnight. Refineries are not flexible. They are complex systems built for a specific type of input. And this is where Venezuela enters with a force that Trump cannot simply wish away. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. About 303 billion barrels, roughly 17% of all global reserves. But more important than quantity is quality. Venezuela produces extra heavy oil from the Orinoco Belt with a density that is ideal for mixing with U.S. fracking oil. It is dense. It has long molecular chains, and it fits perfectly into the refineries that the United States has adapted. And here is another advantage Trump cannot easily replicate: geography. Venezuela is only 4 or 5 days by ship from oil terminals on the Gulf of Mexico. Compared to the 30 to 40 days it takes to transport oil from the Middle East, this is a massive strategic difference. In a world where tensions are rising and supply chains are fragile, that proximity matters far more than most people realize. Geopolitical tensions can shut down the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea at any moment. Having a supplier with the largest oil reserves on the planet right in your Caribbean backyard is a national security advantage that has no price. So what does Trump do? Instead of recognizing this dependence, instead of negotiating in a smart way, he decides in December 2025 to order a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going in and out of Venezuela. He writes on Truth Social that Venezuela is completely surrounded by the largest navy ever assembled in the history of South America, that the impact will be like nothing they have ever seen before, and that they must return to the United States all the oil, land, and other assets they supposedly stole. On December 17th, 2025, Trump publicly declared that Venezuela took oil rights away from U.S. companies. He said word for word, according to CNN reports, "They took our oil rights. We had a lot of oil there. They kicked out our companies and we want it back." He is talking about the nationalizations that happened in 1976 under Carlos Andrés Pérez and later under Hugo Chávez in 2007. In one case, it was almost 50 years ago, in the other 18 years ago, yet Trump speaks as if he could reverse history with military threats. But here is the brutal contradiction that exposes imperial panic. While Trump threatens and blocks, his own economy is suffering from the lack of Venezuelan oil. Diesel is in short supply around the world, according to many analysts, largely because of sanctions on Venezuelan and Russian oil, and U.S. light crude cannot easily replace it. American refineries would like much more access to Venezuelan crude because it helps them operate more efficiently, and it is usually cheaper. Francisco Monaldi, director of the Latin American Energy Program at the Baker Institute, explained this dilemma clearly. For Venezuela to move from producing about 1 million barrels per day, which is its current output according to PDVSA data reported by Reuters, to 4 million barrels per day, it would require around a decade and roughly $100 billion in investment. PDVSA itself admits that its pipelines have not been modernized in 50 years and that the cost of upgrading the infrastructure to return to peak production levels would reach about $58 billion. So we end up with this absurd situation. The United States needs Venezuelan oil. U.S. refineries were built to process it. Without it, they produce less diesel than the economy needs. But instead of making investment easier, instead of gradually lifting sanctions in exchange for reforms, instead of negotiating, Trump is blocking ships, seizing cargoes, and threatening military invasion. It is like destroying the factory that produces the part your own factory needs to keep running. And this is where the layer appears that reveals the real decline of imperial power. Trump cannot simply take Venezuelan oil as if this were the 19th century. He can send warships, he can seize tankers, he can even invade militarily, but he cannot force U.S. oil companies to invest $50 to $100 billion to rebuild Venezuelan infrastructure without political stability, without legal security, and without contracts they can trust. In the final weeks of December 2025, officials from the Trump administration contacted U.S. oil companies to gauge their interest in returning to Venezuela, according to sources cited by CNN. The response was lukewarm. The companies were hesitant to commit, especially given the serious doubts about the country's future stability. ExxonMobil did not respond to requests for comment. ConocoPhillips said it would be premature to speculate about any future activity or investment. And do you know why? Because those companies remember very well what happened when Hugo Chavez nationalized their assets in 2007. They lost billions of dollars. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips were pushed out of the country without proper compensation. They are not going to invest another $50 billion without absolute guarantees that it will not happen again. And Trump cannot provide those guarantees because he does not even control the country, because any regime he imposes would be seen as illegitimate, and because the history of U.S. interventions in Latin America is full of clear and costly failures. But the contradiction goes even deeper when you look at who is buying Venezuelan oil right now. China purchases about 68% of Venezuelan crude, according to data cited by CNN. It buys it at a discount, ships it using a shadow tanker fleet to avoid sanctions, and uses it to power its industrial economy. Russia, India, and Turkey make up a second group of buyers. The United States, which used to be Venezuela's biggest customer, now only receives the volumes produced by Chevron, the only major Western oil company allowed to operate under a treasury license. And here is the sharp irony. Chevron accounts for about 10% of Venezuela's national production, according to press reports. It produces roughly 250,000 barrels per day. Trump renewed Chevron's license, with some changes because he has no real alternative. He needs that oil, yet at the same time, he is blocking all other ships and continuing to threaten the country with military force. It is creating an environment of instability that makes it impossible to increase production. As a result, China ends up taking most of Venezuelan oil, using it for its own industry, building long-term relationships with Caracas, and investing in infrastructure in exchange for future oil. The United States, meanwhile, is left with scraps, a limited level of production from Chevron and refineries that are running below their optimal capacity because they do not have enough heavy crude to blend with shale oil from fracking, and the situation keeps getting worse. Trump's blockade does not only hurt Venezuela, it also harms the U.S. economy itself. In September 2025, the United States was importing about 102,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, according to official data. That number may look small, making Venezuela only the 10th source of imported oil, but it is very important for refinery balance. When Trump blocks those ships and sanctions more oil companies, as he did on December 31st, 2025, sanctioning 4 companies and blocking 4 vessels, according to CNN, he is not only punishing Venezuela, he is also punishing American refineries that depend on that heavy crude. Oil prices reacted briefly when Trump began seizing ships in December. U.S. oil went above $60 per barrel, but then it dropped again to around $57, according to market data. Why was there no bigger shock? Because Venezuela simply does not produce enough oil to move the global market in a major way. It produces around 1 million barrels per day, less than 1% of total world production. The global market can absorb that loss without much trouble. But for the United States specifically, and especially for refineries designed to process heavy crude, that loss does matter. It is not catastrophic, but it is meaningful, and most importantly, it is completely unnecessary. It is a self-inflicted wound, damage the United States is doing to itself because of a mix of imperial arrogance and technical ignorance. Now let me show you the geopolitical layer that Trump completely ignores. Increasing Venezuelan production would not only help the United States, it could also be used as a geopolitical weapon against Russia. Europe and the rest of the world could get more of the diesel and heavy oil they need from Venezuela and stop buying it from Russia. According to Phil FN, Russian oil is similar to Venezuelan oil, heavy, sour, and difficult to refine. That is why India and China still depend so much on Russian oil, despite Western sanctions meant to limit Russia's ability to finance its war in Ukraine. If the United States were strategically smart, it would support the rebuilding of Venezuela's oil industry under conditions favorable to the West. It would flood the global market with Venezuelan heavy oil, lower prices, weaken Russia economically, and give Europe a real alternative to Russian oil. But instead of doing that, Trump is blocking tankers and threatening invasion, creating exactly the chaos that pushes Venezuela even deeper into the arms of China, Russia, and Iran. In fact, 80% of Venezuelan oil exports in November 2025 were bought by China. About 16% went to the United States thanks to Chevron's license, and around 2% was sent to Cuba, according to Reuters. China is winning. It is locking in access to the largest oil reserves on Earth, while the United States is losing influence with every threat it makes. Here is the dilemma Trump cannot solve with warships or sanctions. Venezuela's problem is not a lack of oil. There is plenty of oil, about 303 billion barrels waiting underground. The problem is political and infrastructural. Corruption, poor management, and U.S. economic sanctions caused production to fall steadily from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1999 to about 1 million today. That decline was not inevitable. It was created. The sanctions Trump imposed in 2019 during his first term effectively blocked all PDVSA crude exports to the United States. Those sanctions, combined with the expulsion of foreign companies under Chavez, lack of investment, and decaying infrastructure, produced the current disaster. Now, Trump pretends he can fix that disaster with more pressure, more blockades, and military threats. It is like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. The truth is that rebuilding Venezuela's oil industry requires three things that the United States under Trump cannot or will not provide. First, political stability. Companies need to know that the government signing contracts will still be there in 10 or 20 years, that contracts will be respected, and that there will not be another nationalization. Second, massive investment. We are talking about $50 to $100 billion over a decade to modernize pipelines, repair wells, and build new infrastructure. Third, time. You cannot double or triple production in a few months. Even under perfect conditions, it takes years. Trump cannot offer any of these three. He cannot guarantee political stability because any regime installed through military intervention would be seen as illegitimate and would face constant resistance. He cannot force private companies to invest $50 billion without solid guarantees, and he clearly does not have the patience to wait a decade while reconstruction happens slowly. So what is left to him? Rhetoric, threats, and symbolic blockades that hurt the United States more than Venezuela. Above all, what is left is the clear exposure that the empire can no longer do what it once did so easily. In the past, the United States entered Latin American countries, removed governments it did not like, installed puppet regimes, and took control of resources. It did this in Guatemala in 1954, in Chile in 1973, and in many other countries during the 20th century. That no longer works so easily. The world has changed. China offers an alternative. It buys oil without political conditions and invests in infrastructure without lectures about democracy. Russia sells weapons and military technology. Iran shares experience on how to survive under sanctions. Venezuela is no longer isolated like it would have been in 1980. It has options. So here's the question you should ask yourself. What does all of this say about the real state of the American empire? It says that it can no longer impose its will even in its own hemisphere. It says it is making decisions that weaken it because the image of power matters more than material reality. It says U.S. leaders no longer understand the technical dependencies of their own economy. It says the decline is real, deep, and accelerating. Let me briefly summarize what we have covered. First, technical dependence. The United States produces light oil through fracking, but its refineries need heavy oil to operate efficiently and produce diesel. Venezuela has the largest heavy oil reserves in the world. This dependence is not optional, it is structural. Second, the self-destructive contradiction. Trump is blocking the very oil his economy needs, sanctioning the ships that carry it, and threatening the country that produces it. It is like cutting the branch you are sitting on. Third, the lost geopolitical advantage. China is buying most of Venezuelan oil, building long-term relationships, and securing access to critical resources. The United States is left with leftovers and underused refineries. Fourth, the limits of military solutions. Trump can send warships, seize tankers, or even invade, but he cannot force companies to invest tens of billions without guarantees. He cannot rebuild infrastructure in months. He cannot create political stability through military force. Fifth, the real cost. Every threat pushes Venezuela closer to China, Russia, and Iran. Every sanction weakens U.S. refinery efficiency. Every blockade exposes the fact that the United States can no longer impose its will, even close to home. Sixth, the false alternative. Trump talks about Canada as a substitute for heavy crude, but Canada is already selling everything it can to the U.S., about 4.1 million barrels per day. Canadian oil also faces logistical limits, being landlocked and far from deep water ports, making transport slower and more expensive. The core idea is simple. When an empire enters decline, one of the clearest signs is that it starts making decisions that weaken it while believing they make it stronger. Threatening Venezuela while depending on its oil is exactly that kind of decision. It is imperial arrogance colliding with material reality, and reality always wins in the end. Trump can declare blockades, seize ships, and post threats on social media, but he cannot change the physics of oil. He cannot redesign refineries in months, and he cannot make fracking magically produce diesel. Meanwhile, China moves forward, builds ties that will last decades. Russia sells military technology, and Iran shares knowledge on surviving sanctions. Venezuela, instead of collapsing as Trump expects, adapts, finds new buyers, and learns to operate in a multipolar world. The only clear loser here is the United States, but denial in Washington runs so deep that they cannot even see it. If this analysis helped you understand the deep contradiction at the heart of Trump's policy toward Venezuela, share it. Save it for the next time you see headlines about blockades and threats without the context of why the United States actually needs Venezuelan oil, and share your view. Do you think Trump understands the trap he has created, or is he simply improvising without grasping the technical consequences of his threats? Stay alert, because what is happening with Venezuela and oil is a perfect lesson in how declining empires destroy themselves while believing they are showing strength. And this is only the beginning.